This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind, with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of communications at the University of South Florida and author of a new book entitled Thank You for Dying for Our Country, Commemorative Texts and Performances in Jerusalem, that was recently published by Oxford University Press. The book is a detailed study of the visitor book at one of Israel's most celebrated former battlefields, the Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem, and offers an innovative glimpse into the culture of national commemoration in this country. Professor Chaim Noy, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, I'm very happy to be here.
Okay, so let's start with the setting. Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem was the scene of one of the mythical battles in Israel's history. It was during the Six-Day War between Jordanian and Israeli troops that was later lauded in Israel for the bravery of the soldiers who took part in it. So tell us a bit about the culture of commemoration of this battle and why you chose to focus on this site in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. Israel is known to have a very rich culture of commemoration. It's part of the militarism culture in Israel, and particularly commemoration, and there's been a lot of good research and thought done about it. For some reason, this important site, very important site in terms of national commemoration, hasn't been studied. I'm not sure of why, but the site is located in East Jerusalem, and as you indicated, it commemorates one of the highlights as seen from the Israeli and Zionist perspective, which is the 67 war and what Israel would call the liberation and unification of Jerusalem, that is East and West Jerusalems. And the site hasn't been studied, so I thought, the site is worth studying. And particularly, I was less interested in a top-down view, that is, in how the state and the state agencies and institutions and discourses, how they portray and promote national commemoration, but rather a bottom-up perspective, suggesting how do ordinary folks who come to visit the site, perhaps an equivalent to the Gettysburg battlefield and commemoration site in the United States, how do the ordinary folks who travel to Jerusalem being so holy and so special in Israel, how those visitors themselves subscribe to national identity, to commemoration, how they see themselves within this powerful discourse.
And the platform to do it was to study the visitor book at the scene, at the site. And also, interestingly, the book, the whole setting is very special. It's not just, a small notebook lying around at the exit asking people to maybe drop a line or something. It's something that has a meaning of its own.
Absolutely, absolutely. The minute I saw this visitor book, I have to admit I fell in love with it because it's pretty amazing, and it's even a bit of a chutzpah on my behalf to dedicate a whole book for the visitor book. It's one volume of a visitor book that my volume is dedicated to, and I did it because I really found it very, very interesting. I'm interested in culture and language and the power of language. And this visitor book is suggested by the site as a very important interface where ordinary folks who are visiting the site, all of them are Jews, all of them are Jewish. I've spent there 6 years doing ethnography. So all the visitors I've seen are Jewish.
You mean ethnography, actually talking to people, or just studying what they left behind?
No, by no means only what we left behind. I took this project very seriously, and in 2006 I started visiting the site regularly, interviewing all the people I could interview off the site and off the museum, which is the curator and the directors of the site, as well as interviewing the visitors and observing the visitors as they are writing in the visitor book, and of course reading and doing, I would say, a discourse analysis of what they're writing. And the visitor book is offered in the site as a very special visitor book. As you indicated, it's not a simple note. It's a very decorated and impressive visitor book made not of paper but of parchment. Mm-hmm. It's got logos stamped on it in a vertical way. The logo of the State of Israel, the logo of the Israeli army, the logo of Jerusalem, the lion, of the symbol, and of course the symbol of the site itself, the ammunition hill. So all the visitors who write in the book already write in a book that has national emblems and logos very powerfully this way. You cannot avoid that. And then also interestingly, the visitor book is the only attraction, the only item presented in the special hall where it is presented. So it draws a lot of attention, and therein it's presented on a monument-like structure. So it's very, very impressive, and you have to actually climb a stair in order to stand and approach the book, which reminds of Jewish tradition of Aliyah Torah, of Jewish halakha, of Aliyah. You ascend.
So it adds an element of sanctity to the
Absolutely.
the book.
Sanctity is the key word here, and more so, usually visitor books are located at the exit of sites. When people are leaving the site, they leave their impressions. This visitor book is located what I call at the opposite location, which is in one of the most sacred halls of the museum, very deep into the museum. In the background, there's all the time a soundtrack which is reading the names of the soldiers who've died and their names and ranks and units. And it's one room near the room where the eternal flame of commemoration is located. So on the one hand, it's a visitor book. On the other hand, it's a very serious and somber interface for lay people who are coming to visit the site to literally subscribe into national commemoration.
But then, it's also something on the part of the museum itself, inviting people to take part in this ritual, if you will. How does that affect really the content of what they leave behind, as opposed to other visitor book in other museums and other commemorative sites? So
you're right that museum visitor books are found in many places, and no one has ever dealt with visitor books seriously, and I'm sorry for that, and I'm happy to be able to begin this tradition. Different institutions use visitor book for different purposes, and this is an institution that's interested in promoting and fostering national commemoration and patriotism, and even we could say that a political line that deals with Jerusalem being as it is called, unified forever, or forever unified. And in Hebrew, it's Yerushalayim Meuchadet Lanetzach. So the book is used in a political manner. And the fact is that the name of my book, Thank You for Dying for Our Country, as you can guess, is a text written in that book. And because the book is suggested in such a sacred site, most of the text actually do not comment on the site, such as we enjoyed it here or this was a special experience. These texts appear, but that's not the majority. The majority of the texts, mostly written by Anglophone, by English speakers and English writers from the United States, North America, and elsewhere, actually address the fallen soldiers.
As opposed to native Israelis writing in Hebrew.
Absolutely. Native Israelis would see the site, would comment on the site, sometimes serious comments, sometimes comments such as typical Israeli critiques as, why isn't there any ventilation here and where is the water cooler?
Yeah.
But the idea of why isn't there ventilation here or where is the water cooler suggests that Israelis see the site. They can also say we enjoyed the exhibit and so on. Most of the North American visitors and other Anglophone English writing and reading and speaking visitors would write things like, thank you for dying for our country, which is a bit like a prayer in the sense that who would respond to thank you for dying for our country? Obviously, the people who are addressed by this, text are the ones who fell in battle.
The cynics would probably add, join us again. But before we get to really analyzing the differences between what you just said about perhaps two different cultures of commemoration among Zionist North Americans and native Israelis, I'd like to ask you perhaps about the subject matter itself. And you said that you carried out a comprehensive ethnographic study to complement that. But about the visitor book itself, it's a rather, to my mind at least, an incomplete source. I can tell you from my experience as a journalist that all the feedback that you get is negative. Not where's the water cooler and why isn't there ventilation. But when people are often prompted to give feedback when they have something that annoys them. And is that also what comes out of visitor books in general and this one in particular?
No, I would say it may be the other way around. It's most visitors, on the contrary, draw very positive feedbacks. So I thought if there would be any homogeneity, too much of a homogeneity, that would be around everyone saying, we are grateful to those who sacrificed their lives and so on. And I really had to look into it. But when you really look into the comments in the visitor book, particularly in this visitor book, you find such a rich array of perspectives and voices. That does not include the entire map of, Israeli political affiliation and collective identity affiliations, but it does include, I sometimes call it the battle on the hill remains. And it remains within the pages of this book, and I'm sure shortly we'll get to that. But I think it stands to see per visitor book, to see, what's going on there, just to make sure that we're not anecdotally kind of taking a look at one page or another, but really studying closely with means of studying this layperson rhetoric to see the richness, if it exists, on the pages of the visitor book.
So going back to the point discussed before about the different cultures of commemoration among Israelis and non-Israelis, where do you think it comes from?
Well, the visitor book reminded me, in terms of the Hebrew writing, of everyday Israeli culture as it is practiced in Israel. So, for instance, oftentimes people make impolite comments about other people. People delete other people's comments. In the visitor book, there was one or two occasions where a few pages were ripped out. There are...
But by the way, we're not talking about a single book, right? They probably have an archive of how many?
They have an archive of surely 12 books, and I've accessed all these books. But, when we do the research, and I'm a linguistic anthropologist, so I'm reading these comments, these texts very closely, I was able to really focus into one book. But then I would compare it with the earlier volumes.
Right.
So as for this book, you see things that you're familiar with in terms of there's racist slurs there, as well as very violent slurs headed towards who was then the prime minister, like Ariel Sharon, including, we should murder Sharon, or things that are for people who live in Israel and are familiar with the kind of everyday political vernacular, particularly around right-wing. It's very, very aggressive. There is no...
It probably also changes according to the political context, obviously, right? In times of greater hostility and tension, people react in a more violent manner.
It does, but the restraints and the issue of some kind of common norms of interaction, then it's very Israeli-like. It reflects very much of Israeli culture or the non-present of the culture, in sense of culture being norms of being able to disagree, but at the same time, respecting what each other, not crossing off others' texts and so on.
Right.
The Anglophone texts are different. They're much more respectful, and as I indicated earlier, they would not make any negative comments on the site, or if the site has neglected something. So it's a different. It might also be the case that tourists to Israel and visitors to Israel, even if they're Jewish, they still feel that they're visitors. So maybe commenting on such things as the lighting isn't good enough or it's not ventilated here, they would leave to local battles.
Yeah, sure. And but there's also things to be learned about the different groups of visitors from different ethnic backgrounds that also you delve into in your study, how secular Israelis, left and right, religious Israelis interact with the place and the visitor book in a different way.
So, thank you for this question. It's really interesting, and it gets to the core of the matter. And the core of the matter is that when I try to read it, I have to come with I'm an academic and I'm an intellectual, and I look for a methodology, which means some kind of systematic and interesting and revealing, a revealing view of how I can read those texts that's not necessarily intuitive, that, if I just read those texts, I wouldn't understand them. And I have those different perspectives of how I look at these texts. For instance, one of these characteristics is called addressivity. I ask who the texts are addressed to and by whom. So, for instance, we mentioned that "Thank you for dying for our country" is addressed to those soldiers who have died at the site, in situ. At the same time, other texts, most of the Hebrew written texts, are addressed to the people who are in charge of commemoration. So it would be, thank you for building up this museum. Thank you for taking care of this museum. So that's one way of looking at it. The other point is seeing this visitor book as not simply an out-of-context interface, but rather the context is the narrative that the museum supplies. So in this case, I would ask, how are the people who are writing comments, the visitors, the different groups of visitors and types of visitors, how are they echoing, responding, or mirroring to the ideological, political narrative that the site suggests?
According to the one that they come from.
In light of the culture they come from, but for instance at Ammunition Hill, and we could ask this question in different sites, and my other research studies have been done also in the United States about Jewish heritage sites. But at Ammunition Hill, I will see by the way the visitors write how they recognize the narrative that the site mediates. And then what is their position to that narration. So it's very interesting because you see visitors who don't care about the narrative of the site. They could say, I'm very happy today. Just some kind of nonsense, But then some of them, and most of them, the large majority, they recognize this site. They would say something like, we understand the people who died here, the soldiers who gave their lives here. We understand that we too need to do that if time comes. Or they would show disagreement. And that's how you see the differentiation between groups. For instance, if I may.
Yeah, what kind of I understand how people subscribe to this grand national narrative, but what kind of disagreements are there?
Exactly. So some people would say, the neighborhood where the site is located has been a secular neighborhood erected right after the 1967 war by Teddy Kollek, the then mayor, Jerusalem's legendary mayor. But then the neighborhoods have become occupied by Jewish Haredi, like ultra-Orthodox Jews, some of whom are non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist. So they would enter the site, and the site is...
Would they enter the site?
Yes, they absolutely would enter the site, but not of ideological reasons, but of reasons that the site has a very nice landscape, and they would walk around there, and I would meet them and interact with them. They would speak Yiddish, but write in Hebrew or in English, and then I would say, why, you speak Yiddish, but you write in Hebrew and English? They would say, well, we want people to know what we're writing, to understand what we're writing, and that would be correct. And they would suggest some things like, we were here at the site, we understand what the site is telling, but you have to understand this is all in God's hands. It has nothing to do with the soldiers, nothing to do with the generals. Sometimes they can even be sharp by saying something like, all the soldiers who died here, that's in vain. It's all in...
What about Palestinians, by the way? It is in East Jerusalem. Do they ever visit the site?
No, Palestinians don't. It's in East Jerusalem, and it's located right across the street from a large Palestinian high school, and Palestinians don't enter the site, and I think for reasons that are quite obvious, in the sense that this site celebrates the victory of the great victory of the 1967 war from the Israeli perspective, the defeat of the Jordanian Legion. And actually, Palestinians are not mentioned in the site at all. I mean, they're not. The battle is portrayed as between two armies, and the entire Palestinian presence is completely invisible.
So it's Israelis versus the Jordanians.
The Jordanians. Right. I mean, you wouldn't know that there is another actor who's actually, one of the important
But they might take advantage of the visitor book to write all sorts of profanities.
They don't. I think that they're reluctant or afraid to go into the site. The site often has soldiers visiting it. The site serves as location where Israeli IDs are handed out for high schoolers. It serves as a military ritual location for the paratroopers. I think Palestinians are reluctant from entering it. I'm just going back to the former point. Besides ultra-Orthodox, non-Zionist Jews, for instance, settlers would be there. And settlers would say, similarly, we've been here, we understand the narration, but are you now going to give it back to the Arabs as you've done with Gaza, or as you've done with Oslo, and as you've done with Sinai? So they have their own comments regarding the narration and the ideology that the site narrates.
Well, what about the museum authorities themselves? Do they engage with the feedback that they get in the visitor books, or do they just stash them and archive them?
Regrettably, I have to say that they basically stash them and archive them, as you've suggested.
Did you get any comments to your book or to your study from them?
No, that's as well. And they're not the only site. I've done research in other museums, both in Israel and in the United States, both commemorative and Jewish heritage sites, Holocaust heritage site, and just Jewish community heritage sites. And it seems that today museum directors and curators have so much on their hands that the question of actually listening to audiences and being able to read not anecdotally, but seriously, to pay attention, this is something that doesn't happen enough. And one of the reasons I've published my book and wrote my book, and one of the audiences I address this book to are precisely those audiences. I also want to say that, spending hours and hours and days and months in various museums, the people from the museum who do access the book often are actually not the curator and the top tier, but rather the volunteers and the museum docents who are much more in touch with the museum. They sometimes suggest to visitors to write in the museum, and they monitor what's written in the visitor book. And they would often say, when I did the research in these museums, they would often call me and say, "Did you see what someone just wrote here?" Or
so they would actually look over the shoulders.
Absolutely, they would take the pulse. As one of them told me, the visitor book is how you take the pulse of the museum. But the second floor, third floor, where the directors are, where the curators are, where the fundraisers are, they have it's like a whole different management issues. So.
Well, if anyone on the second and third floor is now listening, I highly recommend you read Chaim Noy's new book. Thank you for Dying for Our Country, Commemorative Texts and Performances in Jerusalem, that recently came out in English, was published by Oxford University Press. Professor Chaim Noy, thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
Fire is burning, fire is burning inside our house. Fire is burning, flames and